You are given a pandas data frame and you want to check whether it is empty or not. First, let us define what does it mean for a data frame to be empty in pandas. A data frame is said to be empty if it does not have any rows. So, a data frame containing no data, that is, no rows, will be considered an empty data frame. Let's look at an example. Here we use the pd.dataframe function to create an empty data frame. We do not pass any data to this function, and thus we get an empty data frame. You can see that on printing the data frame itself, we get that this is an empty data frame and it does not have any columns or any rows. Now, how do we check if a data frame is empty or not? There are multiple methods with which you can check whether a data frame is empty or not. A straightforward method is to use the empty property of the data frame. So each data frame has this empty property that gives us a Boolean value, which essentially tells us whether the data frame is empty or not. You can see that we use this property on the data frame created above, and we get true, which is the correct answer because the data frame is an empty data frame. There are other methods as well that you can use to check if the data frame is empty or not. These methods specially compare the number of rows in the data frame to 0. For example, you can use the shape property of the data frame to get a tuple of rows and columns and then compare the value at the 0th index in the tuple, which is the number of rows in the data frame, with 0. That is, if there are 0 rows in the data frame, we can say that the data frame is empty. So if we print out this particular statement, we get true because the data frame above is empty. You can also use the Python built-in len function, which calculates the length of iterables. So if you pass a data frame to the len function, it will give you the number of rows in the data frame. So if we compare the number of rows with 0, we again get true because the data frame that we created above is an empty data frame. Now, a question for you. Let's say we have a data frame which does have some rows or one row, and all the values in the data frame are nan. Do you think will this data frame be considered an empty data frame or not? For example, you can see this particular data frame. It has one row and one column, and the value in that particular row is nan. So, should this data frame be considered an empty data frame or not? Fundamentally, based on the definition that we set for an empty data frame, this data frame should not be an empty data frame because it does have a row. So let's apply the 3 methods that we saw above to check whether this particular data frame is empty or not. So we'll first apply the empty property. We'll use the empty property. Then we'll compare the number of rows with 0 using the shape property. We get the number of rows at the 0th index. And then we'll use the len function to calculate the number of rows, and which we'll compare with 0. You can see that we get false from all these 3 methods, which is the correct answer. That is, this data frame will not be considered as an empty data frame. Now, another question for you. Let's say you have a data frame that does not have any rows, but it does have some column names. Will that data frame be considered an empty data frame? Let's look at an example. So we use the pd.dataframe function to create an empty data frame. So we will not pass any values, but we'll set some column names for this data frame. For example, let's say we want this data frame to have name and age columns. Now, if we print out this data frame, you can see that this data frame is also considered as an empty data frame because it does not have any rows, even though it has 2 columns, which are name and age. But since it does not have any rows, this data frame is considered an empty data frame.